On the night of March 8, 2014, it was a very ordinary flight. A Boeing 777 aircraft belonging to Malaysia Airlines took off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport, heading to Beijing Capital International Airport. On board, 227 passengers, 12 crew members, total 239 people. There was no bad weather. There was no warning. There was no indication that this flight would become the greatest aviation mystery of the modern era. The last words. At approximately 1:19 a.m., the pilot made the last contact with air traffic control. He said a very ordinary sentence. "Good night, Malaysian 370. On the evening of March 7, 2014, life was moving as usual at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Thousands of travelers walked through the airport's vast corridors. The sound of rolling suitcases echoed across the polished floors. Departure screens were filled with the names of cities and flights. Airline staff completed the final check-in procedures while passengers sat in waiting areas, checking their phones or enjoying a cup of coffee before departure. For most people, it was just another ordinary night of travel, while without anyone realizing it, the hours ahead would mark the beginning of a mystery that would captivate the world for years to come. Among the dozens of flights preparing for departure that night was Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. Its destination was Beijing, China. A routine flight expected to take approximately 6 hours, a route the airline had flown hundreds of times before without any significant issues. At 12:41 a.m., the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway for takeoff. The plane was a Boeing 777, one of the safest and most reliable commercial aircraft in the world at the time. There were no technical warnings, no security alerts, no signs of bad weather. Everything appeared completely normal. Inside the cabin, passengers had settled into their seats. Some closed their eyes, hoping to get some sleep before the long journey. Others watched movies or sent their final messages to family and friends. Perhaps one passenger typed, "I'll arrive in the morning." Another may have been counting the hours until a long-awaited reunion with loved ones. On board were 239 people, 239 different stories, 239 different dreams, 239 human lives. Not one of them knew that the world would be talking about their flight for decades. There were business travelers returning to China, university students, tourists, employees, families, children, infants. People who had carefully planned the days ahead, unaware that those plans would never become reality. At the front of the aircraft, inside the cockpit, sat Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a highly experienced pilot with thousands of flight hours, a man who had spent years flying commercial aircraft across the world. Beside him was his first officer, a young pilot at the beginning of his career, dreaming of a long future in aviation. Everything seemed routine. In fact, it seemed even more ordinary than usual. There was nothing that attracted attention, no arguments among passengers, no security concerns, no reports of suspicious behavior, not even any expected turbulence. At exactly 12:41 a.m., the aircraft lifted off from the runway. The lights of Kuala Lumpur slowly faded beneath its wings. With every passing minute, the plane moved farther away from Malaysia and continued northeast toward China. To air traffic controllers, the flight was proceeding exactly as planned. To the passengers, there was no reason for concern. But somewhere during those early hours of the journey, something mysterious was unfolding. Something no one noticed at the time. Something that would transform an ordinary flight into the greatest aviation mystery of the 21st century. In just a few minutes, everything would begin to change. And the final words the world would hear from this aircraft would soon become part of history. When we think about airline flights, we often focus only on the numbers. The number of passengers, the number of crew members, the departure time, the arrival time. But behind every number is a human being, and behind every human being is a story. Flight MH370 was carrying 239 people on board. To the airline, it was simply a number in the flight records. To the families of those people, it was their entire world. Most of the passengers were Chinese citizens returning home after business trips or short vacations in Malaysia. There were also passengers from different countries around the world. Some were traveling for the very first time. Others were frequent flyers whose careers required constant travel. Among the passengers were business professionals who had just finished important meetings and were preparing to return home. There were university students carrying big dreams for their future. And there were entire families sitting side by side, talking about the days ahead and the plans waiting for them after landing. Somewhere inside the cabin, a small child slept peacefully on his mother's shoulder. Elsewhere, a passenger watched a movie on the screen in front of him. Another was reading a book. Someone else stared out of the window into the endless darkness beyond the aircraft. An entire world of lives was moving through the sky inside this metal machine. As for the crew, they were performing their duties just as they would on any other flight. The flight attendants moved through the aisles. They made sure passengers were comfortable. They served drinks. And they answered the usual questions. None of them knew that this would be the last flight of their lives. At the front of the aircraft sat Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a 53-year-old pilot, a man with extensive flying experience. Among his colleagues, he was known as a calm professional who genuinely loved aviation. He had spent many years behind the controls, and he had completed thousands of flights without any significant incidents. Seated beside him was First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid, much younger than the captain. In fact, this flight represented one of the most important steps in his professional career. A long future in aviation seemed to lie ahead of him, or so he believed. At that moment, no one knew that the names of these people would soon appear on television screens across the world. No one knew that their photographs would fill newspapers and that their families would spend the years ahead waiting for a single answer. What happened? But before the world began asking that question, a small event was about to take place inside the cockpit. An event that seemed completely ordinary at the time, yet it would later become the last known communication from Flight MH370. And those few simple words would mark the true beginning of the mystery. After MH370 departed from Kuala Lumpur Everything appeared completely normal. The aircraft was steadily climbing to its assigned cruising altitude. The engines were operating normally. The instruments showed that all systems were functioning properly. And weather conditions along the route were relatively favorable. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into the familiar routine of a long-haul flight. Some closed their window shades and drifted off to sleep. Others watched movies or listened to music. Meanwhile, the cabin crew moved through the aisles, carrying out their duties as usual. At that moment, there was no reason for concern. But in aviation, a highly precise system governs aircraft movements. During long international flights, responsibility for monitoring an aircraft is transferred from one air traffic control center to another as it leaves one airspace and enters the next. MH370 was approaching one of these transition points. A routine checkpoint crossed by hundreds of aircraft every day. As the plane neared the boundary of Malaysian airspace, responsibility for tracking it was supposed to pass to air traffic controllers in Vietnam, a routine procedure, one that happens every day and usually takes only a matter of seconds. At approximately 1:19 a.m., Malaysian Air Traffic Control contacted the aircraft for the final time. A reply came from the cockpit. The words were short, simple, calm, and so ordinary that no one paid special attention to them at the time. The captain said, "Good night, Malaysian 370. There was no tension in his voice, no distress call. No indication that anything was wrong. It was the kind of routine phrase spoken by pilots thousands of times every day around the world. Yet the chilling irony is that these words would later become the last confirmed message ever received from flight MH370. At that precise moment, no one knew that this simple sentence would be replayed thousands of times in news broadcasts, documentaries, and investigations over the years that followed. After the transmission ended, controllers expected the aircraft to establish contact with Vietnamese air traffic control as planned. But that never happened. At first, nobody was alarmed. Aircraft occasionally take a few minutes before making contact. Minor communication issues can occur, so the situation did not immediately raise concern. 1 minute passed, then 2, then several more. Nothing. The aircraft never contacted Vietnam. Controllers attempted to call it. No response. They tried again. Silence. A third time. Still nothing. At this stage, a subtle sense of concern began to emerge inside the control centers. Not fear, not an emergency. Just the feeling that something unusual was happening. Something small, perhaps, but not normal. Meanwhile, the aircraft was still believed to be flying somewhere over the darkness stretching between Malaysia and Vietnam, or so everyone thought. What nobody knew at that moment was that a mysterious event had occurred almost simultaneously with those final words. Just minutes after the last transmission, the aircraft's transponder stopped sending data. This device acts as the aircraft's electronic identity card. Through it, controllers can determine its position, altitude, and speed. And suddenly, that information disappeared, as if the aircraft had switched off its own identity. It was not a normal occurrence, and it was not easy to explain. But the real shock had not yet arrived. While air traffic controllers were trying to determine why communication had been lost, the aircraft was doing something entirely different. Something the world would not discover until days later. Something that would make investigators realize that MH370 had not simply vanished. It had changed course in a mysterious way, as if someone on board had made a decision whose reason remains unknown to this day. As the sun rose on March 8, 2014, MH370 was no longer simply a delayed flight. It had become an international crisis. In the early hours after the disappearance, many officials still hoped for a simple explanation, perhaps a communications failure. Perhaps an emergency landing at an unknown airport. Perhaps a temporary malfunction in the tracking systems. But as time passed, these possibilities began to fade one by one. The only confirmed fact was this: an aircraft carrying 239 people had vanished, and it had vanished in a way that nobody could explain. But what happened next was even stranger than anyone had imagined. In the days that followed, the largest search operation in modern aviation history began. Warships, surveillance aircraft, satellites, and rescue teams from numerous countries. Everyone was searching for the missing aircraft. But the ocean was vast. So vast that finding a single airplane seemed almost impossible. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and with every passing day, hope faded a little more. Investigators began gathering every remaining piece of data: radar records, communication logs, satellite information. Eventually, a rough picture of what may have happened started to emerge. After disappearing from air traffic control screens, the aircraft appears to have changed course unexpectedly. It then continued flying for several more hours over the ocean until it eventually ran out of fuel, and after that, silence. A silence that remains unbroken to this day. Over the years, dozens of theories have emerged. Some point to a catastrophic technical failure. Others suggest the possibility of human intervention, and some have proposed far more mysterious explanations. Yet, despite extensive investigations costing hundreds of millions of dollars, no definitive answer has ever been found that satisfies everyone. Several pieces of debris linked to MH370 were eventually recovered, small fragments carried by ocean currents to distant shores. These pieces became the only physical evidence confirming that the aircraft ended its journey somewhere in the Indian Ocean. But the exact crash site remains unknown. As for the families of the passengers and crew, time has never provided the answer they have been waiting for since that night. What really happened, and where did flight MH370 disappear? More than a decade after its disappearance, the case remains one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. Perhaps that is why the story of MH370 continues to captivate the world. Because people can accept tragedy. People can accept loss. But what is much harder to accept is uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that leaves a question unanswered, and perhaps that question will remain for many years to come. Where did flight MH370 go? And what happened during its final hours? Until the aircraft is found one day. This mystery will remain one of the most puzzling, unsolved cases in human history. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. And let me know in the comments, which theory do you believe is the most likely? Until next time, for another story and another mystery from the world's most fascinating unsolved cases.